Thanks go to Dick Flanders, Lisa Lunderi, and John Richards for scheduling our program. Several sources of information helped create our program. A book was written in 1983 by the owner of the Waterville Inn, Grace Bean. The title of that book is The Town at the End of the Road. In 1952, Nathaniel Goodrich wrote the first book-length history of Waterville. He also conducted as much historical material as he could. His job from 1912 to 1950 was librarian at Dartmouth College, and he placed 14 bankers' boxes in the files in the Dartmouth archives. Our Waterville Library has scrapbooks from the WV Athletic and Improvement Association, known up there as the WVAIA. We discovered 2 boxes of glass slides in a cabinet at Town Hall and decided to scan all 160 of them. The glass slide images run from 1860 to the 1950s. A glass slide is comprised of 2 pieces of glass permanently taped together. At first, people painted on glass, which was projected to a screen for entertainment. Later, it became possible to print photographs on glass. The earliest photographs in our collection were taken in the late 1800s and were made into glass slides in the early 1900s by Reverend Cornelius Patton, a Waterville summer resident and cottage owner. Reverend Patton collected the photographs and had a firm in Boston produce the slides. After his death in 1939, Mrs. John Norton, whose maiden name was Margaret Goodrich, had more glass slides made. You can imagine how much fun it was for the guests at the Waterville Inn to see images of themselves, their predecessors, and the valley. Many of the glass slides have brief labels, but most do not. So Preston did research on many people, places, and buildings in order to bring you our program.
This is part of a map of the area around the hotel in 1913. Arthur Goodrich, Nathaniel Goodrich's father, created the map. Arthur Goodrich and his brother, Charles, discovered Goodrich Rock, which is named for their family. In addition to building hiking trails, Arthur produced meticulous maps from the 1890s through the 1920s. On this map, the straight lines joining dots to small circles are golf holes. The large hotel is labeled near the top center, and 1553 below it is the elevation of the valley floor. The dot just below the hotel was the first golf tee. Follow the line down to the small circle of the first green. Across the road was the tee for the second hole, which continues straight down the map. Most of that hole and the road beside it exist today. The road, now Boulder Path Road, runs between golf holes up past today's tennis center. I'll add the tennis center in a moment. To the left of the golf hole are 2 small crosses. The top X was the location of Waterville's first hotel, which was opened in 1860, but burned in 1861 before its second season started. Today, there are woods down that side of the fairway, and the properties are private homes. The second and lower cross is the site of the old alley. Waterville has had 2 bowling alley buildings. They were called bowling saloons. The first was on this site from 1860 to 1903 when it collapsed under heavy snow. This is the upper part of the map. To help locate these buildings, I have overlaid the present tennis center. It overlaps the end of the 1868 hotel, which was there until it burned 99 years later in February of 1967. This commemorative sign between today's tennis center and the Waterville Academy marks the 1967 hotel site. You can see edges of tennis court fencing and the Academy training jump. Back on the map, the dotted lines heading to the left are Stone Tower Lane today. The second bowling alley was near it. To the right, the circle with the crooked line is the stone tower and wall. This is what the tower looked like in 2017. It was built as a ruin by Reverend James Buckley in 1880, 3 years after he built the Buckley summer cottage next to it. Both the cottage and the tower remain today. The next building down is a vacation cottage, built by Edward Conable, a Michigan businessman in 1863. The Conable cottage was eventually replaced by a modern home. Below that is the annex, built in 1860 by Mrs. Mary Taylor as the first vacation home in Waterville. That building became additional lodging for hotel guests. Just above Stone Tower Lane is Tecumseh Lodge, opened in 1902, the first winterized guest building. Tecumseh Lodge burned in 1935, but the white clapboard Waterville Academy building occupies its spot today on the corner across from the library. The hotel location is also the location of the Greeley family home. By the mid-1840s, they had moved there from their original hillside cabin. To the right of the hotel is Greeley Hill, with its hillside cottages. The top one, which is not labeled here, is the Pond Cottage, built in 1886 by Chester and Almeda Pond. Chester Pond invented a small electric motor he used to produce self-winding and synchronized clocks, and he was a friend of Thomas Edison. In Grand Central Station in New York City, the clocks above the Central Information Kiosk and above the main 42nd Street entrance were produced by his company in 1913. The second one down is the Palubit Cottage, built by Reverend Francis Palubit in 1883. The name is French, but this is New England. It's pronounced Palubit. The next one is Briggs and Davis, built by Frank Briggs, a businessman, in 1880 with a friend of his, Mr. Joshua W. Davis. The bottom one, across what is now Snows Mountain Road, is the Elliott Cottage, built in 1911. The Elliott family owned the hotel from 1883 to 1916. Those 4 cottages are still there. In summary, the first summer cottages, Taylor, Conable, Buckley, and Buckley Tower, are on the west side of Boulder Path Road. The others, Pond, Palubit, Briggs and Davis, and Elliott, are on Greeley Hill to the east. On Greeley Hill, above and between the Palubit and Briggs and Davis cottages, is a cross marking the site of the first Greeley cabin. Nathaniel Greeley's epitaph reads, "Settled in April 1831, the date when he built his log cabin on this site on Greeley Hill. There was no road into the valley, only an ox cart path. He soon developed a business housing guests. The first documented visitor came in the summer of 1835. He was Ephraim Bull, who created the Concord grape in his garden in Concord, Massachusetts, in the 1840s. He worked as a gold beater, one who beats gold into gold leaf for bookbinding and gilding. In 1854, Ephraim Bull placed his entire grape stock on the market. After one lucrative year, sales plummeted because the commercial nurseries propagated and sold the vines, paying him no royalties. In Waterville in the 1840s and 1850s, fishing was the attraction. Nathaniel Greeley cleared 100 acres of the hillside and then acquired land on the valley floor and built a new house there, probably by 1845. The second Greeley Hotel in 1868 was attached to that Greeley house on the valley floor. 2 of the glass slides show Nathaniel Greeley. Here's a picture on the grounds of the Conable Cottage, which was built in 1863. And here he is in a group picture from 1870, standing at the far right, around the time he turned over management of the Greeley house to his son Merrill and daughter-in-law Lizzie, who had been the resident Waterville schoolteacher before marrying Merrill. This is a comparison of the 2 pictures. In the late 1800s, the Cascades had individual names. This is a picture of Greeley's Cascade from a stereo view produced by a photographer in Campton, E.J. Young. One of the glass slides is a 1904 picture of the first Cascade. A comparison shows them to be the same Cascade. Another slide shows the third Cascade in 1900. There is a stereo view of Profile Falls. Here's the comparison of third Cascade and Profile Falls. Again, they are the same. This cascade was also known as Glenwood Falls. The profile is not there today. Sometime in the last 100 years, the lower jaw disappeared. Getting back to the Greeleys, they opened the first hotel in 1860 at the site off Waterville's 8th Fairway. Nathaniel was 58 then, and he had 2 sons in their late 20s. This is probably the earliest image in the glass slide collection, 1860. The hotel, called Greeley's Mountain House, was huge. It accommodated 150 guests. 1,000 people forming a procession 2 miles long are said to have come to its opening on July 1st, 1860. Here's a tattered announcement, now held in the Dartmouth archives, advertising the second season of the hotel in 1861, right before it burned. Above the bold-faced stages near the bottom is billiard hall. And although the first 2 letters are missing, a bowling saloon, as it was then called, is emphasized by ornate lettering. When the hotel burned on June 10, 1861, there was talk of arson, but that was never determined. It was never rebuilt. Nathaniel Greeley and his son Merrill catered to summer guests in the Greeley home, known as the Little Red Cottage, until 1868, when they opened a second, smaller hotel attached to their home. It held 60 guests, compared to 150 for the first hotel. When the second hotel opened in 1868, the announcement was similar. A billiard hall is not listed, but the bowling saloon is highlighted once again. And, this being advertising, the summit of Mount Osceola is listed at 5,200 feet and said to provide a view surpassing in beauty and grandeur the view from Mount Washington. Merrill Greeley, Nathaniel Greeley's son, was the proprietor. Here's a slide of the 1868 hotel in winter, although it was closed then, with the Greeley's Little Red Cottage attached on the left. A picture from inside the hotel shows, very faintly, the framed picture of the first hotel on an entrance desk. The Waterville Valley Resort has celebrated its 50th anniversary, but Waterville was a vacation destination for more than 100 years before the resort started. By the 1860s, Waterville had a summer colony centered at the hotel to which people returned for generations. The guests were successful, but generally not wealthy. The wealthy could travel from one luxury White Mountains hotel to another by train. But the last segment of the journey to Waterville was by wagon or stage from Plymouth. Train service did not reach Campton until 1883. Initially, visitors came to stay in the mountains and fish. Then hiking became a big part of the summer. Bowling was popular starting with the first hotel in 1860. Croquet was being played by 1871. Golf arrived in 1898 when 2 men, Dr. Frederick Briggs, a physician, and Reverend Francis Palubit, each brought equipment back from Scotland. Frederick was the nephew of Frank Briggs, one of the builders of the Briggs and Davis cottage in 1880. This is a slide from 1901 of a group improving the golf course, otherwise known as picking up stones. They picked up 3 cartloads that day, confirming that one of New Hampshire's most prolific crops was rocks. The course was first laid out in the meadows after hay had been cut, but the coming of the automobile drastically reduced the number of horses the hotel had to feed and allowed the golf course to have its own space. This picture was taken during the first Ladies' Championship, probably in 1900. The course had sand greens then, which were not replaced by grass greens until 1951. A favorite activity was hiking, referred to in early years as tramping. Here's a group in 1874 headed for Osceola, well equipped with staffs. This is 1880. Here are the fashions of the day for a walk in the woods. 40 years later, women were known to ditch their long skirts once they were in the woods and hike in their bloomers. This group is headed up Osceola in 1887. And here is that group at an outlook on the Osceola Trail. This is 1902 at the Cascades. Here's a prosperous group of gentlemen with their wives on a return from Osceola in 1904. And with the opening of winter accommodations in Tecumseh Lodge in 1902, winter hiking became more popular. This is on the Osceola Trail, December 1904. In addition to a growing trail network, shelters, called camps, were built around the valley and used for parties and overnights. This is Coit's Camp, which was in the woods uphill from the golf course. There was also a log shelter near the top of Osceola, which was used often. Here are 4 young ladies on top of Noon Peak in August of 1910. From the left, the Norton sisters, Grace and Louise, Alice Goodrich, wife of Nathaniel, and Margaret Goodrich, Nathaniel's sister. In September the next year, 1911, 2 of them, Margaret Goodrich and Grace Norton, set off for Carrigan, looking very comfortable carrying an axe. This tug of war looks a little unfair, and the young woman looking at the camera looks like one of the Norton sisters. And here's an interesting sequence from a 1913 hike to Carrigan. We have 8 hikers leaving and 7 returning 2 days later. Picnics at the Cascades were popular. This is 1915. And here are 3 women during the winter of 1916. Waterville vacationers did not come for luxury. In 1892, toilet facilities were still outhouse stalls in an adjoining shed. Although the main floor had gas lamps, guest room lighting at night was a candle taken from the table at the foot of the stairs. This was living in the mountains, not just viewing them. And this ox cart photo is dated 1872. A number of clergymen were summer residents. Religious services were held every Sunday, and morning prayer services were held weekdays after breakfast until just before 1900. There were also lawyers, educators, and a few businessmen. The guests were not stuffy. They had fun. An entertainment committee went to some lengths to put on a summer production. This is the cast of the play, The Spirit of '76, which was put on in 1872. The play is a satire portraying local government with women in elected office. This was 48 years before the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was passed in 1920. Although women could not vote, in May 1872, 3 months before the play was produced in Waterville, Victoria Woodhull was nominated for the presidency of the U.S. by the Equal Rights Party, the first woman nominated for President of the United States. She and her sister were publishing a weekly newspaper in New York City and operating their own Wall Street brokerage firm. Victoria had announced her candidacy 2 years earlier in 1870. This picture, including costumes and a golf bag, was for a one-club golf tournament. Groups of costumed players would start from all the tees simultaneously, a memorable sight. Over many years, some regular summer visitors built vacation cottages, but even the families with cottages ate meals at the hotel, which was the center of activities. Edward Conable of Jackson, Michigan, started coming to Waterville in 1859, before the first hotel was built. And in 1863, he built the Conable Cottage, the second vacation home. One glass slide shows him on the grounds of his cottage in 1872. He is on the far right. He was born in Massachusetts and went into business with his brother making farm tools in Ohio when he was 22. By 1847, he had moved to Michigan and was making farm tools for the Michigan State Prison. Here's another Waterville picture. Again, he is on the right. He retired in 1863, the same year he built the Waterville Cottage, which is in this slide. Because Conable lived in Jackson, Michigan, his cottage was called the Michigan Cottage. The valley had been cleared, so his summer house looks like a small building in a big valley in this winter photograph. He was early. The second hotel did not open until 5 years later, and the next summer cottage would not be constructed until 14 years later in 1877. The cottage, which was built next in 1877, was built by Reverend James M. Buckley, who also built the stone tower in 1880. In 1880, Reverend Buckley was the pastor of the largest Methodist congregation in the country in Brooklyn, and he was elected to a 4-year term as editor of the Methodist weekly newspaper, the Christian Advocate. When he retired 32 years later, He was said to have turned it into one of the top 2 or 3 religious publications in the world. Buckley was a skilled speaker and debater and had been pursued for a dozen years early in his career by the head of a New York law firm who urged him to leave the church to study law and join the firm, a firm which had had 2 members join the U.S. Supreme Court. Ruins were so popular in the late 1800s that they were being built. The stone tower was built as a ruin, and its 1880 dedication included some distinguished participants. A future president of Yale, the first to come from outside the clergy, was in attendance. In the front, bearded with a derby hat, is Sir Daniel Wilson, discoverer of the scour. He became the 3rd president of the University of Toronto. Behind him, with a mustache and straw hat, is Reverend Buckley. In the back is Deacon J.C. Tyler with his arm on his chest, who was president of the Boston Seamen's Friend Society. He discovered Waterville's Tyler Spring, and it was named for him in 1889. This print is in the Dartmouth archives. The Goodriches knew the man with the umbrella as Reverend Buckley, but there's a name written on the back which looks like Woltke. I found no more information, so I thought it might be an inside joke. Then I discovered that the joke was on me. A newspaper clipping in the Dartmouth archives mentions Professor and Mrs. Woltke of Stamford, Connecticut. He was a professor of music at a fashionable girls' school and 2 colleges associated with the Universalists. One summer, he took charge of the choir for Sunday services, and his wife gave a piano recital. Reverend Buckley climbed to the top of the North Tri-Pyramid slide soon after it fell in August 1885 and wrote that story in the Christian Advocate. Nathaniel Goodrich, who climbed mountains in the U.S., Canada, and Europe, expressed his admiration of Dr. Buckley for mentioning his fear as the surface he was ascending began to slide again, as well as his ability to escape unharmed. This slide shows the Buckley Cottage and Tower in 1900. Here's the Buckley Cottage in the winter of 2017. You may not know that the tower has its own name, Noname Castle. In fact, it's carved in stone, Noname, Noname. But if you break up the letters differently, N-O, N-A-M-E, you'll see its origin, no name. Waterville has had 2 bowling saloons. Alley may not have been used because these were separate buildings housing the alleys. This is the first, constructed in 1860, close to the first hotel. And here is an interior picture. This is a closer look at the alleys and scoring table. You can see the ball return trough in the center and pins at the end of the 2 alleys. If the image were sharper, we could see the names. On the right, the name appears to be Briggs. This shows the building collapsed by heavy snow in 1903. This is the new bowling alley built near Stone Tower Lane in 1904. It was repaired in 1930 by the WAIA, but it was used less and less until the owner of the inn, Ralph Bean, dismantled it around 1952. He used some of the wood for golf course bridges. These 3 gentlemen, Mr. Stimpson, Reverend Whittlesey, and Reverend Palubit, are shown on the steps of the first alley in 1900. I do not have information about Mr. Stimpson, but the 2 clergymen were quite accomplished and they had an annual bowling rivalry. Reverend Francis Palubit is on the far right. I mentioned him as one of the 2 initiators of golf in Waterville, so the golf club is appropriate. He was a congregational minister who intended to do missionary work in India but decided to stay in the U.S. instead. He is in this slide from 1882. Being on top of Mount Osceola was part of a Waterville summer. Reverend Palubit's wife, who is side saddled on the pony, wanted very much to get up there, but is described as being lame all her life. In 1882, Reverend Palubit found Katie, a pony who carried her to the top. The next slide shows Reverend Palubit on the right on the croquet court around 1909. Francis Palubit became best known for educational work connected with the Sunday school movement, which began in the late 1860s. In 1872, uniform Sunday school lessons were adopted internationally. All teachers and pupils studied the same passage of Scripture at the same time in the U.S., Canada, and Great Britain. In that same year, 1872, Reverend Palubit began writing quarterly Sunday school lessons. In 1874, the Chautauqua Institution at Chautauqua Lake, New York, was founded to improve teacher training for the uniform lessons. And the following year, Reverend Palubit published his first volume of Palubit's Select Notes on the International Lessons, which covered the individual lessons for that year. This is what the book looked like in 1889. He produced an annual edition until his death in 1920. Over 2 million volumes in this series were sold during the 44 years he wrote them. As many as 150,000 copies were sold in a year. He had the Palubit Cottage built in Waterville in 1883. His is the middle cottage in this slide of 3 on Greeley Hill. In order from the left, they are the Pond Cottage, the Palubit Cottage, and the Briggs and Davis Cottage. Here's the Palubit Cottage in 1898, 15 years after it was built. And here it is above the tennis shop in 2017. Going back to the picture on the steps of the bowling alley, the gentleman in the center has the most distinctive name I've come across so far, Eliphalet Whittlesey. Reverend Whittlesey became a congregational minister in Bath, Maine in 1851. In 1861, he became professor of rhetoric and oratory at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. In August 1862, he obtained a 6-month leave of absence from Bowdoin to join the Civil War and became chaplain of the 19th Infantry Maine Volunteers. He resigned as chaplain to join General Oliver Howard's staff as a captain, and immediately after the Battle of Sharpsburg, or Antietam, Reverend Whittlesey was promoted to the rank of major for his conduct. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, his horse was twice wounded under him. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, where he was characterized as a fearless and faithful staff officer, he returned to Bowdoin for a year. Eliphalet was a young boy's name from the Bible, meaning God delivers me, and it had been his grandfather's and great-grandfather's name. Here he is in Waterville much later, 1903. In September 1864, he left Bowdoin again to join the Army of the Tennessee under General Sherman. He became a lieutenant colonel in March 1865, and 3 months later was appointed colonel of the 46th U.S. Colored Infantry. In May the following year, 1866, he was breveted brigadier general. He was known in Waterville as General Whittlesey, which I neglected to mention so that I could tell his clergyman story without giving away the punchline. In Waterville, the Whittleseys became the second owners of the Connable Cottage. General Whittlesey became fiscal agent for the trustees of Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he and General Howard personally guaranteed payment of the $150,000 cost of the school's 150-acre site at a time when the university had no funds. He later was a Howard University professor and dean. He was appointed to the Board of Indian Commissioners by General Grant, and he died in Washington in 1909 at age 88. He and his wife are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The Whittleseys had 3 sons and 2 daughters. Their daughter Pauline and son Jim appear in a glass slide, also showing Professor and Mrs. John W. Chickering from Washington, D.C. The Whittlesey daughter and son are in the back, standing on either side of the Chickering's daughter in this picture from 1886. The Chickerings are seated center and right. Professor Chickering was a botanist and a congregational minister. He climbed Mount Katahdin in 1850 and in 1858 to study and collect alpine flora, and climbed Mount Washington for the same purpose in 1862. His 20 publications include an 1876 catalog of the alpine and subalpine flora of the White Mountains, and a dozen institutions, including the Smithsonian and the New York Botanical Garden, hold plant specimens he collected. He was a professor of natural science at Gallaudet College in Washington for 29 years, starting in 1870. Gallaudet was founded in 1864 as the first school in the world offering advanced education to the deaf. Two branches of the Briggs family were represented in Waterville. The senior Briggs family member was Francis Frank Chickering Briggs, Professor Chickering's cousin. Frank Briggs, with his friend Joshua W. Davis, had the Briggs and Davis cottage built in 1880. The cottage is above today's tennis courts. Mr. Briggs' grandfather and great-grandfather had been congregational ministers, but he worked in Boston with his brother Richard importing china. He left due to poor health to study painting at the Boston Art School and to travel in Europe. When he was 50, he visited the Hampton Institute in Virginia with Professor John Chickering, his cousin. Although it was illegal to educate slaves until after the Civil War, classes for escaped slaves were started unofficially in 1861 outside Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. General Samuel Armstrong officially opened the Hampton Institute in 1868 with the mission of educating blacks. Native American students came later. The students worked to pay for their education. General Armstrong asked Mr. Briggs to work 2 to 3 hours a day, which would allow time for painting and relaxation. But Frank Briggs took over purchasing, buildings, and student accounts at the school. When, after 24 years there, he died in 1908, his painting supplies had never been unpacked. Former students, blacks and Native Americans, were his pallbearers. Frank Briggs is in this croquet slide from 1872. From left to right, we have Mary Batchelder, who later married Arthur Goodrich, and Mrs. Nathaniel Batchelder, her mother. Miss Mary Briggs, sister of Frank Briggs, is next, then Frank Briggs. Miss A.M. Fletcher is far right. There is another Mary Briggs picture, this one in 1902. The Briggs family collected accounts of early Waterville, which were used by both Waterville history authors, Nathaniel Goodrich in 1952 and Grace Bean in 1983. And they collected the stereos E.J. Young of Campton produced beginning in the late 1800s. The collection of stereo views is in the Dartmouth archives. This shows a viewer with a stereo photo in place. The other branch of the Briggs family in Waterville was that of Dr. Frederick Briggs, a nephew of Frank Briggs. He organized golf in Waterville for many years and was a physician. Turning to the history of the hotel, this slide from about 1880 shows the Greeley House Hotel with an L, which was in the dining area in the back. In 1883, the Greeleys sold the hotel to Silas and Carrie Elliott, who had a farm in Thornton, close to where Upper Mad River Road comes down the steep hill to cross the river at 6 Mile Bridge. One of the glass slides is a family portrait from about 1893 of the Elliots, to whom the hotel was sold in 1883. Mary, the youngest daughter, grew up to marry John Foster and have a son, Dr. Elliott Foster. Both men were leaders of the Waterville Cottage Association. Mary is on the left of the family group and on the left of this family picture of her with her sister Layla. One unidentified glass slide is a pair of portraits which must be Silas and Carrie Elliott. Another unidentified slide is a bride. I believe she's Carrie Elliott when she was 20 and married Silas in 1879. Waterville has had some notable periods of success, including the first 20 years of Elliott's Hotel. Once again, this is the predecessor Greeley's Hotel in 1880. In 1883, the year the Elliots bought the hotel from the Greeleys, the railroad reached Campton. In 1886, the hotel was expanded with a wing on the east. In 1895, it was expanded west and north. This is Tecumseh Lodge, which was opened in 1902. It offered the first winter accommodations. And here's the hotel in 1908 with the lodge in the background. Silas Elliott died in April 1894. 2 weeks earlier, Ephraim Elliott, Silas' father, had passed away. And 3 months after Silas' death, Bessie Elliott, the second of the 4 Elliott daughters, died at age 11. Carrie Elliott ran the hotel for another 16 years, but couldn't have done that without employees like Alex Sutherland, who is in 2 glass slides as the stage driver. He's standing center in this 1900 picture. We know him because a print of the next slide identifies him. He's also mentioned by Nathaniel Goodrich as running the hotel's logging business during the winter of 1900. There were certainly other key employees. People pass this spot at Osceola Library in Waterville frequently, but seldom notice the stone. It's an 1885 memorial to William Brown. It looked like this 15 years after it was erected. There is a photograph in the Dartmouth collection with a notation which reads, "A gray stone to keep green the memory of William Brown." The stone itself reads, "To keep green the memory of William E. Brown, a faithful mountain guide, a brave soldier and manly Christian, 1885, erected by the guests." He was 40 years old and single when he died in Waterville on July 20, 1885, and it is impressive that the guests would erect a monument to a hotel employee. He's buried in Blair Cemetery in Campton. In the 1880 census, he was one of 9 men boarding with Merrill and Lizzie Greeley, who were then running the hotel. 6 were carpenters, 2 were brickmasons, and William Brown's occupation is listed as gathers spruce gum. Spruce gum was chewed and used on skin injuries in addition to being used as a sealant. Carrie Elliott built herself a cottage, the Elliott Cottage, in 1911 on a site said to be the location of the small Greeley family cemetery. Nathaniel Greeley's first wife died in 1862. His second wife died in 1878, and his third wife died in 1880. They were all buried in a small plot on the hill. He was buried there also when he died in 1884. This is a picture of the plot in 1910. Based on what can be read on the sign in the background, it is a verse, "When the day break and the shadows flee away." In his 1952 History of Waterville, Nathaniel Goodrich wrote concerning the graveyard that it was a curious and not really characteristic callousness that led Mrs. Elliott, who coveted that knoll for a site on which to build a house, to move the headstones to the Thornton Cemetery. They were moved to Mad River Cemetery. Here's a picture from 2017. The Greeleys had sold the hotel property to the Elliots in 1883, but Goodrich was mistaken about who moved the graves. Brenda found the 1911 request to move the graves signed by the Greeley family, not Carrie Elliott. And a Greeley granddaughter wrote that the Greeleys moved the graves because the forest was encroaching and the family was no longer in Waterville to keep up the plot. There are 2 pictures from 1900 or earlier of the site of the future Elliott Cottage showing a summer house, what we would call a gazebo, on the hilltop. This is one. Cemetery markers would have been in place starting in the 1860s. Enlarging the summer house part of the picture shows what could be the gravestones in the trees to the left. Mrs. Elliott built the house in 1911, the same year the Greeleys moved the graves, and it became known as the Foster Cottage 5 years later when Mary Elliott and her husband John Foster inherited it. This slide shows the cottage. The Fosters had a tradition of telling first-time visitors in particular that the house was built on the site of the graves and that they were not sure that all of the remains had been removed. The effect of the story may have been heightened by the fact that the house had a dirt basement floor, typical at that time. There is a reference to the cemetery being near the Foster cottage, so the house may not be on the site of the graves themselves. In any case, the Fosters had fun with their story. As Brenda mentioned in her introduction, the glass slide collection, which is the basis for this presentation, was created by Reverend Cornelius Patton, a Waterville summer resident and cottage owner. This is Cornelius Patton in Waterville, August 31st, 1932, when there was a total eclipse. His father was a congregational clergyman who served as the 5th president of Howard University in Washington, D.C. Cornelius, the son and creator of the glass slides, married Pauline Whittlesey, the daughter of General Whittlesey, in 1889 in Washington. At that time, his father was president of Howard University, where her father, General Whittlesey, was a major force. Cornelius and Pauline had 2 daughters, Augusta and Catherine, and settled in St. Louis, where he was a congregational minister. The Pattons eventually became the owners of the Whittleseys' Waterville cottage, which had been built by Edward Conable in 1863. This is a more formal picture of him in Waterville. He was active in the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and when he became Home Secretary in 1904, he was given a reception at the Hotel Vendome in Boston, which was attended by almost 400 people. By 1910, Reverend Patton and his family were living in Newton, Massachusetts. In this picture, the woman on the left is Augusta Patton, then Catherine Patton, and their father, Cornelius Patton, who died in Waterville in August 1939. Catherine Patton, as a younger woman, appears on the left with Louise Walworth on a raft in Greeley Pond in this slide. One of the earliest recorded summer guests, whose family returned through the years, was Nathaniel S. Batchelder, a grocer from Concord, New Hampshire, who first came in 1862. That was 6 years before the 1868 hotel, and in 1864, his 11-year-old daughter, Mary Batchelder, came for the first time. In 1875, Mary would have been 22, a young Massachusetts teacher was hiking Osceola, saw the hotel in the valley, and came down to stay. The teacher was Arthur L. Goodrich, who married Mary 2 years later. Arthur Goodrich was the trail builder and map maker. The Goodriches had 3 children, Nathaniel in 1880, Hubert in 1887, and Margaret, who appeared in a number of the hiking pictures, in 1889. They bought the Buckley cottage in 1888. This picture shows Arthur Goodrich with the dog. Son Nathaniel is in front of him. Arthur Goodrich and his brother Charles discovered Goodrich Rock, and Arthur discovered the Kettles. He built the Scour Trail, probably in the late 1880s, and the Kettles Trail around 1890. Beginning in the 1890s, Arthur created the first accurate maps of the valley and the hiking trails and geographical features around it. He updated the maps into the 1920s, and Waterville hiking maps were based on his work for decades longer. Here's Arthur at a favorite stop on the Boulder Trail. In 1892, he wrote the first Waterville history, a 30-page pamphlet, half history and half trail guide, and then revised it in 1904 and 1916. In this picture, Mrs. Arthur Goodrich is seated, with son Hubert and daughter Margaret standing. Son Nathaniel married Alice Lyman in 1908. She appears in family pictures from then on. Starting on the left, in this family picture on their porch are Mary Goodrich, Mrs. Arthur Goodrich, son Nathaniel, who was the Dartmouth librarian and wrote the 1952 history, Arthur Goodrich, who wrote the 1892 pamphlet and made the first accurate maps, son Hubert, who's grandfather to the Scrimshaw family, daughter Margaret, who was in a number of the hiking pictures, and Alice, who married son Nathaniel. Nathaniel was librarian at Dartmouth from 1912 to 1950 and oversaw the move into Baker Library in 1928. Nathaniel was a mountain climber and worked on trails, in the White Mountains in particular. He published the first book-length history of Waterville in 1952 and placed as much historical material as he could gather in the Dartmouth archives, which preserved it, enabling us to write this presentation. Nathaniel Goodrich wrote about trail work in the Appalachian Mountain Club's journal, and he wrote about the effects of logging on the trails. The original logging in Waterville was done for winter income, and a number of settlers built sawmills. This is the Drake Mill. After the farmers left, land and paper companies acquired their acreage, and in the late 1800s, large-scale clear-cutting began in Waterville and continued through the 1930s. These companies drove the logs down the Mad River to Campton. Logging camps and dams were constructed as each area was cut, and hiking trails were completely blocked by debris and had to be abandoned for years, if not permanently. Here's the log pile below Flume Brook Dam in February of 1919. Logs were piled below dams during the winter, then water was released in the spring to drive them down the Mad River to Campton Pond. The view in this slide is towards Sandwich and Flat Mountain, and I believe the clouds are smoke from the last major fire in the White Mountains, the 1923 Flat Mountain logging fire. It burned over 3,000 acres, was uncontrolled for 4 days, and one logger fighting the fire died. It stopped at the top of the ridge above Waterville, perhaps thanks to an updraft on the Waterville side. Heavy rain put it out, but it smoldered for over 2 months. The mountain in this glass slide is Tri-Pyramid, and the pond is behind a logging dam at Swayze Town. 2 locations off what is Livermore Road today were named for settlers in the early 1840s. Neither family appears to have stayed for much more than 5 years. Beckytown, near the base of South Tri-Pyramid, was named for Rebecca Blanchard, who lived there with her husband Frank. When the South Tri-Pyramid slides fell in 1869 and 1885, they buried part of the property. A logging camp in that area was known as Beckytown in the early 1900s. This is Swayze Town Dam, which is long gone. In 1915, there were 3 major dams, Mad River, West Branch, and Swayze Town. Swayze Town is off Livermore Road, closer to Waterville than Beckytown, and was named for Ebenezer Swayze. Here's a promotional sheet, probably from 1900 or a little earlier, of the attractions near Waterville. We know only some of them today. Our final picture comes from the Dartmouth Archives. This is a younger Arthur Goodrich, and as he seems to be indicating, I will close with onward, in our case, into Waterville's past. Thank you. We're happy to take questions.
Was there a mill at the Flume Brook Dam?
There was not a mill at the dam, but there were a number of mills spread around Waterville. There also were quite a few dams. The pictures we showed you tonight were just of a couple of the major dams.
Was there a mill on the Tecumseh Brook that comes down Mount Tecumseh?
Not that I know of.
Was there one on the dam that comes off of Corcoran Pond?
There was Drake's Mill, which would be, I believe, on Snow's Brook, which is what feeds Corcoran Pond. The mill would have been closer to the Mad River. Corcoran Pond was dammed up above that.
It was dammed up above what?
Above where it joins the Mad River.
How was it dammed? Did they have to blast any rock?
I don't think they had to blast much, but they did have to create the dam and let the area behind it fill up. It had been a brook that ran through there without any blockage, and the idea of creating it was to create a pond to be part of the center of the town. And it does attract quite a bit of activity, so that part's worked.
This dam looks like it's logs here, but maybe some stonework. It looks mostly log.
They would,
a wooden bridge, a wooden dam.
right, the dam at Corcoran that created Corcoran Pond is a cement dam that was done in very modern times. These dams would have been built with logs. The shore areas were completely built up of rocks. There are a couple locations of the old dams where you can see the rock piles along the shore. The dams are long gone. And before I forget, we had one question before we started to speak here about a short history of Triple I Road. Triple I Road leads from Waterville to Woodstock. The short history is that in 1877, Nathaniel Greeley built a bridle path that went very close to that route. That went the whole distance, Waterville to Woodstock, but for the next number of decades, the development was all on the Woodstock side. In 1907, there was a large lumber mill put in Woodstock, and in 1909, that lumber company, the Woodstock Lumber Company, built a logging railroad, the Woodstock and Thornton Gore Railroad, which operated from 1909 until 1914. Then in 1911, East Pond was mined for Triple I, which is diatomaceous earth. It has the silica skeletons of diatoms, microscopic animals that lived in water. The silica is separated, ground, and then, crushed to smaller and smaller pieces. Depending on how finely it's ground, it is eventually used as a polishing agent, for instance, in silver polish. It was actually used as a filler by Alfred Noble in his TNT. It's used as a filtering agent, and it also was used in the paper industry in a couple different ways. But the Livermore III company, which started in 1911, was close to the III road and actually used the logging railroad that had been built in that far. The railroad stopped operating in 1914 because the huge mill had burned in 1913, and the next mill was not located there. It was down on the Beebe River. And the III mining company stayed in existence till 1919. As an interesting piece of trivia, the Henry family owned that property. He was a big lumber baron, and his granddaughter refused to sell the East Pond 11 acres of land because she thought the III mine might someday be valuable to her. So in the 1920s, all the surrounding land, which had been clear-cut, was sold for $2.75 an acre. When she died, the granddaughter, the remaining 11 acres was sold, I think in the 1990s, for $65,000. Wasn't a bad decision to hold on. So the Livermore Road reaching Waterville did not happen until the Depression. In about 1934, it was completed from the middle, which had always gone out to Woodstock, into Waterville. There was actually some controversy in town about having that road at all. The town was very pleased to be, as the title of Grace Bean's history, the town at the end of the road. They liked the isolation. They did not want to be on a through road. When the Forest Service routed the road, they didn't route it directly through town. It passes slightly on the other side of the river, and in the end, it's quite an asset. And as was pointed out at the time, in the case of a major forest fire, and there were some in the not too distant past at that point, that was a second way out of town, which was not a bad idea.
What's the historical population of this area if you exclude people in hotels and so forth?
In general, it's very low. First of all, the area became populated very late. It was property of the state until 1819. The 1818 agreement for the Gillis and Foss grant, you can find, if you search for it on the internet, what you'll get is a couple paragraphs describing the property because it was a legislative act in 1818. The agreement was to sell the land, 33,000 acres for $1,663 to two men if the payment had been raised or guaranteed by the next meeting of the legislature, which was the next year. That all happened. I haven't found the record of the transfer, but clearly it happened, so that would be 1819. 1829, there were 5 farming families that incorporated the town as Waterville, and around 1830, in the early 1830s, they got up to maybe 11 families, and I think 70 some people, but that was the peak. As you can imagine, farming in Waterville Valley was not easy. What they produced in a year was astounding. I don't have the figures with me, but I've talked in other cases about them. But it was not an area that people could farm, and as the West opened and then the Civil War, farming was not something that was that sustainable, although farms lasted until 1900 in some cases. The population was declining from 1830s pretty much on. I don't know the population before the resort, but in recent years, well, last year the population was 478. The number of voters was 350. That's up 50 in population just in the last 3 or 4 years. If you go back 15 years or so, the population is more like 200 and some. In fact, if you search on the internet for Waterville population, for some reason they say that the census of Waterville gives numbers in the 200s pretty much to the present. That's not quite right. I'm not sure where the difference is. But I do know that the town clerk counts people and the town is up to 478 residents.